I want to tell you something I have never said out loud in full until now. I woke up staring at ceiling tiles, white flat with tiny holes in them like someone had pressed a pin into the surface 1,000 times. I did not know what day it was. I did not know how long I had been there. I knew I was in a hospital because of the sound, that specific, low, persistent hum of machines doing the work your body cannot do on its own. I knew I was alive because everything hurt. And I knew before I even turned my head that the chair beside my bed was empty. That chair, I keep coming back to that chair. Every hospital room has one, the chair that is meant for the person who loves you most, the person who refuses to leave, the person who is there when you open your eyes. My chair had a blue vinyl cushion and a small dent on the armrest. It sat 18 inches from my hand, and for 7 days not one member of my family sat in it. Before I take you through everything that happened, I want to ask you something first. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city or your country in the comments below. I genuinely love knowing who is out there on the other side of this screen. And if this story speaks to something you have lived through, if it touches something you recognize, please hit the like button and subscribe so you do not miss what is coming. Because what happened over the next 7 days changed every single thing about the life I thought I was living. And the truth, when it finally came, did not come from the people I expected. Stay with me. My name is Helene. I am 31 years old and I grew up in a household where one word described my role from the time I was old enough to understand roles: responsible. I was the one who got the grades, held the jobs, made the plans, kept the peace. My younger brother Elric was the dreamer, the creative one, the one the family circled around with a kind of breathless hope that I was somehow never the recipient of. I did not resent it for a long time. I told myself that being needed was the same as being loved. It was a Tuesday, 5:30 in the morning. I was on Meridian Avenue driving to the office before sunrise because I had a presentation and I always prepared better in the quiet of an empty building. A pickup truck came through a red light at full speed and hit my driver's side door. I remember the sound of it. It was not the bang I would have expected. It was more like the world being folded in half. I remember the airbag. I remember my phone sliding under the seat. I remember thinking, strangely, that I had not replied to an email from my boss Yoni. And then I do not remember anything at all for 31 hours. I woke up in the ICU at Regional Medical Center with a fractured thoracic vertebra, 3 broken ribs, a collapsed lung that had been reinflated during emergency surgery, and 14 stitches along my left temple. The surgeon who spoke to me used the word lucky. I remember turning that word over in my mind like a stone, trying to find the smooth side of it. The person who had spoken to the surgical team on my behalf, who had sat in the waiting room for 6 hours while I was in the operating room, who was there when I first became coherent enough to understand where I was not my mother. It was not my father. It was not Elric. It was my boss, Oni. She was 54 years old, and she always wore her reading glasses pushed up on top of her head, like she had forgotten they were there. She had driven 40 minutes from her house in the suburbs, because she was listed as my emergency workplace contact, and she took that designation seriously, in a way I had never thought to question before that moment. She sat beside my bed and she held my hand and she told me, plainly and carefully, what had happened to my body and what the doctors had done, and what the next several weeks were going to look like. She told me I was going to be okay, and when I started crying, she did not tell me to stop or look away. She just held my hand tighter. Yoni had called my parents the night of the accident. They were in San Diego. Elric's app launch party was that weekend, a 2-day event at a rented venue downtown. My mother called my hospital room on the second day. She did not call to say she was on her way. She called to explain why she was not coming. I can still hear her voice in that call. It was not cold. That is the thing I want you to understand. It was distracted. The way someone sounds when they are doing 2 things at once and you are the less important one. She said the timing was terrible. She said the doctors had told her I was stable, and that stable meant there was nothing she could do that the hospital could not handle better. She said Elric needed them right now. This was his moment. This was everything the family had been working toward. They could not leave. Then she said the sentence she had been saying to me my entire life. Helene, you understand. You have always been the strong one. And I said yes. I said it the way I always said it, without thinking, without pausing, the way a reflex works. Automatic, learned, deeply, deeply trained. I hung up and I looked at the empty chair beside my bed and I did not cry. I just looked at it. I was not sure yet what I was feeling. It would take me a few more days to find the right word for it. The word I would eventually understand was done. Yoni came every morning before work and every evening on her way home. A nurse named Portia, who had a directness that I immediately trusted, became a quiet presence I anchored myself to when the nights got long. But the chair stayed empty. 7 days, not one phone call from my father, not one text from Elric, not one member of my family who shared my last name walked through that door. I told myself I was fine, I had always been fine, that was the role, that was the job. I was not fine, but I did not know that yet. On the third night I could not sleep. Pain medication makes time strange. Everything is slightly underwater, slightly delayed, like your emotions are arriving a few seconds behind the moment that caused them. I was lying there at 2 in the morning with the machines humming and the corridor lights filtering under the door, and I started doing math in my head. I had been giving money to my family for 3 years, specifically to Elric, specifically to his dream of building a fitness tracking app he had been talking about since his mid-20s. I had never written all of it down in one place. I had always paid in pieces, each piece feeling manageable on its own, each request arriving with enough explanation and enough urgency that refusing felt like choosing to let someone drown when you could easily reach your hand out. So I always reached. That night, for the first time, I added it all up. Year 1, $42,000. That was the initial app development contract with a software team Elric found through an online platform. He could not get a business loan because he had no credit history and no collateral, and I had both. I told myself it was an investment. I told myself I believed in him. Both of those things were true. I want to be honest about that. Also in year 1, $11,000 for legal fees, registering the LLC, filing trademarks, drafting contractor agreements, things that needed to be done correctly from the start, things I paid for without being asked twice. Year 2, $68,000. This is the one that sits with me the most. The first development team's code turned out to be largely unusable. Elric told me this after the fact, after I had already wired the money for a second team. I found out about the failure and the new contract in the same conversation. I remember sitting very still after that call, staring at my kitchen wall, and then deciding not to say what I was thinking. Because he was my brother. Because family does not abandon family when things go wrong. Also in year 2, $22,000 for equipment, laptops, servers, testing devices. Elric said he could not produce professional results without professional tools. I understood that. I sent the money. Year 3, $51,000 for a marketing agency that a friend of Elric's recommended. I never saw the campaign before it launched. I found out about it when someone at work mentioned they had seen an ad that seemed oddly familiar, and I looked it up and realized I had paid for it without ever being included in a single creative conversation. Year 3, final stretch, $31,000 for the launch event itself, the venue in San Diego, the catering, the PR firm, the invitations, the travel and hotel accommodations for industry contacts Elric wanted to impress. The party that at this exact moment, my parents were attending instead of sitting in the chair beside my hospital bed. Miscellaneous. Across the full 3 years, roughly $25,000 in smaller amounts. Rent when Elric's lease went up. A car repair he could not cover. A dental procedure. An online course he wanted to take. A new phone after his screen cracked. Each one small enough to feel like nothing. Total, $250,000. I lay in that hospital bed with a brace around my spine and tubes in my arm, and I let that number sit on my chest like something physical. $250,000, most of what I had saved since I started working at 22, all of it given willingly, all of it given because I believed that being the strong one meant being the one who gave, and that giving was how you proved you loved someone. On day 4, my mother called again. She did not call to ask how the pain was. She did not ask whether I had been able to eat or sleep, or whether the physical therapy team had come by yet. She called because Elric needed a new suit for the launch photo session, and the one he had brought did not photograph well, and could I authorize a wire transfer of $890 so he could get something appropriate before the photographer arrived. $890 for a suit. She said it the way you ask someone to pass the salt at dinner. I was lying in a hospital bed. I had a catheter. I could not sit upright without a nurse helping me shift position. I had not been outdoors in 4 days. I had not heard my brother's voice a single time since the accident, not a text, not a voicemail, nothing. I told my mother I would think about it. I hung up and I did not transfer the money. I want to be clear that I did not do this dramatically. There was no moment of furious decision. I simply did not do it. And that silence, that small refusal, was the first thing in 3 years that was entirely, quietly mine. What I want you to understand is what that $250,000 actually meant in the context of my own life, because it was not an abstraction. That money was a house I never bought. I had been saving for a down payment since my mid-20s, putting away a specific amount each month with the discipline I applied to everything. The account grew and then it shrank, and then it grew again, and then Elric needed something. I moved the money over and started again. That money was a sabbatical year I had planned to take to write. I had notebooks full of ideas for essays, for something longer. I had kept saying next year, once things settled down. Things never settled down because I kept making sure they did not have to, for everyone else. That money was a specialist appointment for a chronic problem in my right shoulder that I kept rescheduling because the out-of-pocket cost felt irresponsible when the family needed help. The shoulder still bothered me. I was in a spinal brace, and my shoulder still quietly ached, and I had been telling myself I would deal with it later for 2 years. That money was a relationship. I had dated a man named Dorian for almost 2 years. He was steady and kind, and he asked me to move in with him, and I said I could not afford it. That was true. I just never told him why. He waited for a few months, and then we drifted apart in the particular way that happens when two people both sense that something is in the way, but neither can see it clearly enough to name it. I had never, not once, framed any of this as sacrifice. I told myself it was love. I told myself it was investment. I told myself this was what family did. On day 5, Ione brought soup from a deli she passed on the way to the hospital. She sat beside me and I ate slowly, carefully, because the broken ribs made deep breaths complicated, and I told her about the money. All of it. For the first time in 3 years, I said the full number out loud to another person, $250,000, and then I told her about the call asking for the suit. Ione was quiet for a long moment. She was not a dramatic person. She did not gasp or shake her head or tell me what I should have done. She just sat with what I had said, and then she looked at me and asked one question. She said, "Helene, you have spent 3 years funding everyone else's life. Who has been funding yours?" I did not have an answer. I had never been asked the question before. I was not sure I had ever asked it of myself. I looked at the empty chair on the other side of the room, and I finally understood what I had been feeling since that first phone call with my mother. Not anger, not yet. Grief, the specific grief of finally seeing something clearly that you have been working very hard not to see. On the 6th day, Portia stopped by my room during a quieter stretch of her shift and mentioned, almost as an aside, that someone had been leaving things at the nurse's station for me. Every night without fail, since the 2nd day I was admitted. Night 1, a small arrangement of white ranunculus in a paper sleeve from a florist, left with my room number written on a piece of card. Night 2, a box of a specific brand of herbal tea, chamomile and ginger, the kind that comes in a dark green box with a gold stripe. I had not mentioned that tea to anyone. I had not mentioned it because I had not talked to almost anyone. Night 3, a soft blanket, the kind with a slight weight to it, rolled and tied with a piece of twine. Night 4, a slim book of poetry, Mary Oliver, a worn paperback copy, not new, the pages slightly soft at the corners from previous reading. Night 5, a small jar of local honey with a handwritten note attached to the outside. The note said for the throat it helps, in handwriting that leaned slightly to the left. Every night, Portia told me, the same woman arrived between 10 and 11 after visiting hours had ended. She would stand outside the ICU entrance for a few minutes. She would leave whatever she had brought on the chair beside the nurse's station. She would ask every single time the same question, "Is she doing any better?" And then she would walk away before anyone could ask her to wait. I had no idea who this person was. Portia, who had a particular kind of quiet resourcefulness that I had come to genuinely rely on, spoke to hospital security. They pulled the corridor footage from the past 5 nights. She brought a tablet into my room and held it so I could see the screen without straining my back. The footage was grainy. The camera angle was positioned high on the wall, looking down the length of the corridor toward the ICU entrance, which meant it caught mostly the tops of people's heads and the backs of their coats. The timestamp read 11:04 on the first night I watched. A woman, probably in her early 60s, though it was hard to be precise, medium height, dark coat with large buttons, hair pulled back at the nape of her neck. She walked steadily without hurrying and stood outside the glass-paneled doors of the ICU for a full 2 minutes and 17 seconds. I watched her stand there. She did not pace. She did not check her phone. She simply stood and looked at the doors, and then she reached out one hand and pressed her palm flat against the glass panel for a moment. Just a moment. Then she turned and placed a small paper bag on the chair beside the nurse's station and walked back down the corridor and out of the frame. I watched the clip 3 times. I did not recognize her. I want to explain why, because it matters. The footage was low resolution, and the angle gave me the back of her head more than her face. I was also, at that point, on a combination of pain medications that made everything feel slightly soft around the edges, slightly delayed, like watching the world through a window that had been breathed on. And beyond the practical reasons, there was something else I will get to in a moment, a reason that the face would not have come to me even if the footage had been crystal clear. But I felt something watching that clip. Some pull I could not name, some recognition that was not quite recognition, sitting just below the surface of whatever I could consciously access. On the 7th night, Portia made a decision. When she saw the woman arrive in the corridor, she stepped out and spoke to her directly. She told the woman that I was awake and that I was asking about her. That was not entirely true, but I have come to believe it was exactly the right thing to say. The woman stood in the corridor for a long time. Portia told me later it was almost 4 minutes, which is a very long time to stand still in a hospital hallway making a decision, and then she walked through the doors. She came into my room slowly, like someone entering a space they were not sure they were welcome in. She stopped a few feet from the bed. The light in the room was low, just the lamp on the nightstand. And it caught the side of her face clearly for the first time. She was 63 years old. She was wearing a dark green cardigan and her hands were clasped in front of her. Her eyes were wet before she had said a single word. She said, "My name is Jessamine." And something moved in me that I cannot fully explain. Not recognition exactly, something older than recognition, something cellular. Jessamine was my father's older sister, my aunt, my biological family. She had been a part of my life until I was 7 years old, at which point she was removed from it so completely, and so finally that I had grown up with only the vaguest impression of her, a face from early childhood that had blurred over 2.5 decades into something I could no longer hold clearly in my mind. 7 years old. I had been 7 when she disappeared from our family, and I was 31 now. That was why I had not recognized her in the footage. That was why the familiarity I felt watching it had no name to attach itself to. She sat down in the chair beside my bed, the chair that had been empty for 6 days, and she told me what had happened. 18 years ago she had spoken up. That was the whole of it, really. She had watched the way my parents structured our household, the way Elric was centered and protected and given patience without limit while I was given responsibility without acknowledgement, and she had said something. She had told my parents clearly and without hostility that they were asking too much of me too young, that they were using my competence as permission to keep asking, that I was a child, not a safety net. My father told her she was out of line. When she did not apologize or retract what she had said, he ended the relationship. No conversation, no final meeting, the way my family ended things, which was total and immediate and never revisited. That was the last time she had been in the same room as any of us. But she had not stopped watching. She was a retired attorney. She had a practice in estate law for over 30 years. She was not wealthy, but she had built a careful, stable life, and she had used small portions of it consistently over many years on me. The scholarship in high school that I received in my junior year, the one my mother called a blessing and I assumed was luck, had almost not come through. The family had missed a financial documentation deadline. The scholarship organization had been about to disqualify my application. Jessamine had found out through a mutual connection, contacted the organization, explained what had happened, and covered the remaining gap herself. The college grant that appeared my junior year, the one my mother attributed to God's timing, also Jessamine. She had identified a private foundation that accepted third-party contributions directed towards specific recipients, and she had used it. The $300 that appeared in my bank account the week before my graduate school enrollment deposit was due, from an account number I did not recognize, that I assumed was a bank error and was too desperate to question. Also Jessamine. And there was a trust. She had established it 9 years ago. It had grown carefully and steadily to $300,000. It was in my name, it had always been in my name. I simply had not known it existed. I looked at this woman sitting in the chair beside my bed, and I felt something break open in my chest, not painfully, but like a window being opened in a room that has been sealed for too long. And through that open window, for the first time in I could not say how many years, something that felt like air came in. I cried, the kind of crying that was not elegant, that hurt my ribs, that made Portia appear in the doorway and Jessamine step back to give me room. When I could breathe again, I looked at her, and I said the only thing I could think of. I said, "Why did you not just tell me?" She said she did not want to insert herself. She did not want me to feel like I owed her anything in return. She had watched my family construct a dynamic in which love was conditional and reciprocal obligation was the currency, and she had wanted, more than anything, to give me something with no strings attached. She just wanted me to have options. She wanted me to have a door in case I ever needed to walk through it. I thought about that for a long time. About every moment I had believed I was entirely alone in what I was carrying. About every time I had wired money I could not really spare and told myself I had no choice. About every version of myself that had sat in a quiet room and done the math, and concluded that the numbers did not work and there was nothing to be done. The whole time there had been a door. I just had not known where to look. 2 days after Jessamine came into my room, my mother called. The launch event had been a success. Elric had gotten press coverage from 2 industry publications and a mention in a startup newsletter with a significant following. My mother's voice was bright in a way I recognized, the particular brightness that meant the family narrative was going well, and she was riding the current of it. She talked about the venue and the speeches and how proud she was. She talked for almost 4 minutes before she asked how I was feeling. I did not match her tone. I had spent 2 days lying in a hospital bed with Jessamine sitting in the chair beside me talking, not about plans or strategies or what to do next, just talking the way people do when they have years of absence to account for and no particular agenda for filling it. And in that space something had settled in me, not hardened, settled, the way ground settles after a long rain. I told my mother, quietly and without drama, that I would not be transferring any more money to Elric or to anyone in the family. I told her I had spent 3 years and $250,000 investing in people who did not sit beside my hospital bed for 7 days. I said I was not calling to argue. I was calling to be clear. I wanted her to hear it directly from me, in plain language, so that no one could later say they had not understood. My mother started explaining. She moved quickly through justifications, pivoting from one to the next. The timing had been impossible, the doctors had said I was stable, Elric's moment could not be postponed, I had always been so capable, she had known I would understand. The words came in a particular order I recognized because I had heard them my entire life, the order designed to make the person listening feel that their pain is a reasonable price for everyone else's comfort. I let her finish. Then I said goodbye. I meant it in every dimension of that word. I hung up and I looked at Jessamine and she looked at me and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she asked if I was all right. I said I did not know yet, but I thought I would be. That evening I blocked my mother's number, then my father's, then Elric's. I did it in order one by one with deliberate patience. It was not an act of anger. I want to be precise about that because I think people expect this kind of moment to be explosive, to be the culmination of fury. It was not. It was quiet. It was the specific quiet of someone who has finally stopped waiting for a situation to be different than it is and has begun dealing with it as it actually exists. Jessamine was sitting across the room when I finished. I told her what I had done. She said one word, okay, just that, okay, like it was a reasonable thing to do, which it was. I was discharged from Regional Medical Center after 11 days with a thoracic spinal brace that I would need to wear for 8 weeks, a physical therapy schedule that would take up 3 mornings per week for the next 4 months, and instructions that I was not to drive for 6 weeks and not to attempt stairs without assistance until my follow-up appointment with the spine team. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building with no elevator. Jessamine had a house 20 minutes from the hospital, single story. She had a guest room with its own bathroom and a window that faced a small garden in the back. She had already set it up before she asked me. New sheets, extra pillows to help with positioning, a shower chair, a small table beside the bed at the right height for a glass of water and a book. She had thought it through the way someone thinks through something they care about getting right. She asked me anyway. Because she was the kind of person who prepares but still leaves the choice with you. I said yes. The first morning I woke up in that room, the light came through the curtains from the east and hit the far wall at an angle that made the whole space feel warm before I was fully awake. Jessamine had left coffee outside the door. She had figured out from our hospital conversations that I took it with a small amount of cream and no sugar, and she had made it exactly that way and left it there without knocking, so I could get to it when I was ready. I sat on the edge of the bed in my brace with the coffee in both hands, and I watched the light move across the garden through the window. And I noticed something I had not felt in so long that I had forgotten it had a name. I was not bracing for the next thing. I was not calculating what someone was about to need or how I would cover it, or what the consequences would be if I could not. I was not mentally managing 3 different people's emotional states simultaneously while pretending to be fine. I was sitting in a room, in the morning, with a cup of coffee, and nobody needed anything from me. That is what peace feels like. I had genuinely forgotten. Yoni recommended a therapist. Her name was Dr. Caldwell, and she had a practice near the medical district that specialized in family systems and what she called financial enmeshment, which was a term I had to look up the first time I heard it, and then spent approximately 45 minutes reading about, because it described my entire adult life with a precision that was almost uncomfortable. I started seeing Dr. Caldwell twice a week, on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, which worked with my physical therapy schedule. The early sessions were genuinely hard. I had spent so many years being the competent one, the reliable one, the one who handled things, that sitting in a quiet office and admitting I did not know how to let people help me without feeling like I owed them something in return was surprisingly difficult. It felt at first like weakness. Dr. Caldwell pointed out, calmly and more than once, that confusing self-reliance with self-protection was one of the more common outcomes of growing up in a household where love was rationed according to usefulness. She gave me a framework I came back to consistently throughout that first year. She called it the difference between love that sustains and obligation that depletes. Love that sustains asks how you are and means it. Obligation that depletes asks what you can provide and reframes the asking as love. I had spent 31 years inside the second thing and calling it the first. Learning to tell them apart was not a single moment of insight. It was slow and sometimes uncomfortable, and it changed the way I understood almost every significant relationship I had ever had. I had also stopped writing, and I had not fully admitted to myself that I missed it. In college, I had kept a personal essay blog that had built over 4 years into something with a genuine following. I wrote about ambition and money and family, and the particular exhaustion of being the person everyone assumed could handle it. I had been a good writer. I had known it without being arrogant about it, the way you know things about yourself that feel less like pride and more like fact. I stopped when the financial demands from my family made it impossible to find the mental space. You cannot write honestly about your inner life when your inner life is entirely consumed by managing everyone else's. During my recovery at Jessamine's, I started again. First in a journal she left on the nightstand without comment or explanation, just there one morning the same way the coffee appeared. Then in longer pieces, fully formed essays that I found myself writing late in the evenings when the house was quiet and the garden was dark outside the window. I sent 3 of them to a former editor I had stayed in loose contact with, a woman named Gillian who had always been direct with me about what worked and what did not. Gillian responded within 48 hours. She wanted to publish all 3. The essays went up over the following 2 months. The response was larger than I had anticipated. People wrote to me. Long, careful messages from strangers who recognized something in what I had described, who used phrases like I thought I was the only one and I never had words for this before. It was the kind of response that tells you that you accidentally wrote something true enough to land in other people's lives. When I returned to work, I only watched what happened to my output when I was no longer carrying a hidden financial crisis on top of my actual job. Within 6 months, she gave me a senior director title and a salary adjustment that, she told me, brought my compensation in line with what I had actually been producing for the past several years. I remember sitting in her office after that conversation and thinking about all the times I had told myself I was managing fine. A literary agent named Marcus reached out after the 3rd essay published. He was soft-spoken and methodical in a way I immediately trusted, and he asked if I had ever considered a book. I told him honestly that I had thought about it for years and had always found a reason to postpone. He said that was common and asked if the reasons were still in place. I thought about it. They were not. The book took 14 months. It was about financial caretaking inside families, specifically about what happens to the children who are designated as capable, what gets extracted from them under the name of love, and what it costs them in ways that no bank statement can show. I wrote it carefully. I was not interested in cruelty. I was interested in accuracy, and I found that accuracy, when applied with enough precision and enough honesty, was more powerful than anything else I could have reached for. The book sold well in its first week, regional bestseller list. By the third month it was on a national list. Marcus called me on a Wednesday morning to tell me, and I was in Jessamine's kitchen eating toast, and I had to sit down. With the trust Jessamine had built and my own savings rebuilt over the course of that year, I bought a house. It was smaller than the house I had once imagined for myself, in a neighborhood with mature oak trees lining the street and a coffee shop 2 blocks away that I became a regular at within the first week. The house had a backyard, and at the back of the backyard, a small guest cottage. 1 bedroom, its own entrance, its own small porch facing the garden. I asked Jessamine to move into it. She pretended to give the question serious consideration for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said yes. We developed a ritual without planning to, the way good rituals happen. Every Sunday evening I cooked and Jessamine brought wine and set the table. Sometimes Ione came and sat at the end of the table and made everyone laugh with stories from 30 years of managing difficult people. Sometimes Marcus came and talked about books and argued with Jessamine about history in a way that was clearly enjoyable for both of them. A woman named Bridget, who I met in a memoir writing workshop 8 months into my recovery, became a consistent presence, the kind of friend who says the honest thing and then immediately makes you feel better about hearing it. It was not a large table, but everyone who sat at it had chosen to be there and had been chosen in return. I met Theo at a reading event for the book. He was in the back third of the room, and he listened with the particular quality of attention that is different from mere politeness, the kind where you can tell someone is actually processing what they hear rather than just waiting to respond. He asked one question during the audience portion, a question so precisely targeted at the actual argument of the book that I answered it for almost 4 minutes without noticing. Afterward, he was at the signing table with 2 copies, one for himself and one for his sister, who he said was going through something the book might help with. We had coffee the following week, dinner the week after. He was a structural engineer who built things carefully and checked his work and did not perform confidence he did not have. He never once asked me for anything I had not already offered. He did not treat my competence as an invitation to extract from me. He was interested in who I was, not in what I could provide. It took me longer than it should have to trust this. I kept waiting for the pivot, for the moment when the warmth would reveal itself as a strategy. It never came, and learning to receive something without immediately calculating what it was going to cost me was one of the quieter, more significant pieces of work I did in those years. 2 years after I blocked my family's numbers, a cousin I had stayed peripherally in contact with sent me a message. My mother had been diagnosed with late-stage ovarian cancer. The cousin was not asking me to do anything. She was simply letting me know. I sat with that information for several days. I did not react immediately, which surprised me. I had expected something violent to happen inside me when I heard it, some surge of either grief or guilt, but what I felt was quieter and harder to categorize. I brought it to Dr. Caldwell. I talked about it with Jessamine one Sunday evening after dinner, sitting in the garden with our coffee while the last of the light left the sky. I did not go to see my mother. I need to say something about that decision, because I think it is the easiest part of this story for people to misread. I did not stay away because I did not care. I stayed away because I had finally learned to tell the difference between what I genuinely owed someone and what I had been trained to perform as obligation. My mother was ill and dying. That was real, and it was sad, and I held it as both of those things. She was also a person who had, for 31 years, organized her understanding of me around what I could contribute to everyone else's life. Going to her bedside would not have changed what had happened between us. It would have reopened a wound that I had worked very hard, with a great deal of help, to close cleanly. Grief is not the same as regret. I grieved. I grieved the mother I had needed and never fully had. I grieved the version of my childhood that might have existed if things had been structured differently. That grief was real, and I did not try to suppress it or rush through it. I just did not let it override the boundary I had drawn with my full clarity and my full consent. When she passed 4 months after the diagnosis, I sent flowers to the funeral home. White peonies. She had loved white peonies. I remembered this from something so early in my childhood that it lived below language, in the part of memory that is all sensation and no story. I sent them with no card and no name, not as a gesture of forgiveness and not as a gesture of coldness. As the most honest thing I could offer, acknowledgement that she had existed, that I had known her, that something between us was now permanently finished, and I was releasing it as gently as I knew how. Elric reached out 3 months after the funeral. He could not contact me directly because I was still blocked, so the message came through the same cousin, which meant he had specifically sought out a workaround rather than respecting what I had communicated clearly. The message said he thought it would be good to reconnect. It said he had been going through a difficult time. It said the app had not sustained its early momentum and things had been hard. It implied financial need without stating it directly, the way our family had always implied things without stating them, as though vagueness made the request more deniable. I read the message once. I did not respond. I did not unblock him. I want to be honest about how that felt, because it was not satisfying in the way people might expect. It was not a moment of triumph. It was sad. It was the particular sadness of watching someone you shared a childhood with continue to repeat the same patterns, continue to reach for the same solutions, continue to treat the people around them as resources rather than as people, without any apparent awareness that this was what they were doing. I could not fix that. I could not have fixed it by giving him more money. I could not fix it by letting him back in. The most honest thing I could do was exactly what I did, which was nothing. The second book was already underway by then. Different from the first in scope and method, less personal essay, more reported narrative. I spent 14 months interviewing people who had rebuilt their lives after leaving enmeshed family systems, people across different backgrounds and circumstances who shared a common thread. They had spent years being the person everyone leaned on, and then they had stopped, and they had survived it, and some of them had done considerably better than survive. I travelled for the interviews. I took Theo with me twice, to cities where he sat in coffee shops reading while I worked, which was its own kind of quiet joy. I took Jessamine once, to a city she had lived in for a decade before I was born, and we spent an evening walking streets she had stories about and I listened to her tell them. I was in the guest cottage behind my house, which I used as a writing studio on the mornings when I needed quiet and a different ceiling to look at, when I wrote the last paragraph of the second book. I had been working toward it for weeks, circling it, writing around the edges of it, sensing the shape of what I wanted to say without quite being able to land on it. And then one morning it was simply there, fully formed, waiting. I wrote it for the version of myself lying in an ICU with a fractured spine and 3 broken ribs and a collapsed lung, staring at an empty chair, telling myself she was fine, telling herself she had always been the strong one, not yet knowing that 40 feet down the corridor, a woman was pressing her palm against a glass door and asking, every single night, if she was doing any better. The paragraph read, "No is a complete sentence. You do not need to explain it, soften it, or apologize for it. The people who needed you to never say it were not protecting you. They were protecting their access to you. And you are allowed at any point at any age to close that door. It does not make you cold. It does not make you ungrateful. It makes you someone who finally understood what love is actually supposed to feel like, and decided that anything less was not something you were willing to keep settling for." I submitted the manuscript on a Wednesday morning. Then I walked out into the backyard. Jessamine was in the garden in her old straw hat, the one that had been through more seasons than it had any structural right to survive, kneeling beside the raised bed where she grew tomatoes and herbs, and a particular variety of marigold she refused to name, but tended with obvious devotion. I brought 2 cups of coffee out and sat on the back step, and she came and sat beside me, and we watched the garden for a while without talking very much at all. "That was enough. More than enough. Now I want to hear from you. If you have ever been the strong one, the responsible one, the person everyone assumed could handle it, I want you to drop a comment below and tell me. When was the moment you realized that being needed is not the same as being loved? That is the question this story left me with for a long time, and I think it might be the right question to sit with. If this story reached something in you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. You might be the person who presses their hand against someone else's glass door tonight without even knowing it. Like this video if Helene's story made you feel something real, and subscribe so you are here for the next one, because the next story is just as honest and just as human as this one. Thank you for spending this time here. Genuinely, thank you to everyone watching who has ever had to rebuild from the inside out, who has had to learn what they deserve by first living through what they do not. I want you to know that the door exists. You do not have to know where it is yet. Someone might be standing on the other side of it right now, waiting for the right moment to walk through. Take care of yourself. You are allowed to do that.